problem areas with double pointed needles. One of the reasons that people don't like double pointed needles sometimes is that they experience this problem we call ladders. You can see there's some looseness in the stitches there. You've got what looks like a loose stitch. Perfectly normal. Just for the record, those are my socks. I knitted those, and I've knitted a few pairs of socks in my life, so I'm still getting ladders. It's not something I particularly worry about. It does come out with washing and wearing. The reason that you get ladders is that the yarn is traveling further between the last stitch of a needle and the first stitch of a needle. If you look at the distance that this yarn has to travel, no matter how tight you pull that, it's going further, just because essentially the tips of the needles are causing them to separate. One of the things you can do to really help avoid the ladders is that if you pull a second stitch tight, that tidies things up a little bit. What's happening with the ladder is that there's just that extra long stretch of yarn between the needles. I'm going to come around here again. And it's being taken up into that first stitch, and so the first stitch looks loose and loopy. You see, it's loopy. It's traveling further. So if when I go to work the second stitch, I pull that tight, it snugs the first stitch up and keeps things close. Sort of counterintuitive. In some ways you think pulling the first one would be the answer. Turns out it's pulling the second one. I also, as I say, I don't worry about it unless they're particularly egregious. They do come out with washing and wearing. What some people like to do is they like to shift the start of the round so that, as you see, as I knit the last stitch here, I will work one more from that needle before I pick up the other needle, so that you're effectively moving the start of the needle, and indeed you'll end up moving the start of the round around. It doesn't eliminate the ladders, but it shifts them in your fabric so they're less obvious. There's less of a column. And again, and you can get into the habit of this, just work one more stitch and then pick up your needle. If you're going to do this, then you definitely will want a marker for the start of the round because you have moved it and it's not as easy to keep track of. Again, my favorite solution for ladders though, honestly, don't worry about it, washing and wearing. Part of the reason that you might get them, and not everybody does, is to do with the arrangements of the stitches and the angles at the breaks between the needles, if you will. If it's too extreme, it can be worse. Some people prefer another method for working this small circumference, magic loop or two circulars. For those knitters who don't like working on double pointed needles, magic loop or two circulars methods is a nice solution. And if you've worked any of our patterns for a small circumference projects like socks or mittens, you'll notice that we talk about small circumference methods of needles rather than simply double points or magic loop, because everybody has a preference. This is the magic loop method. It uses a long circular needle. One note here, my cast on tail for my long tail cast on is a bit too long. It's getting in the way, so I'm just going to knot that up. I prefer to do that rather than cut it short. It's a bit of a superstition on my part, I think. What happens with magic loop is that you are dividing the stitches half and half across two sides of the needle, if you will. It's funny, we refer to it as two needles, but it's really two sides of the same needle. And then once you're set up, I will show you the setup, but it's easier to understand once you've seen me working it. We then work half and half, and to do this, this is our home position. The stitches are arranged so that you're on the bodies of the needles, and the working yarn is hanging off the back. I'm going to pull the rear needle out, just do that slowly, and swing it around. And this is the magic loop bit where you get these bunny ears, if you will. What I'm going to do is I am going to knit a few stitches. And why this works and why people like it, of course, is that there are no needles to drop. So very useful for travel knitting. No more dropping a double pointed needle on the bus and watching it roll down the aisle. And also because these are very close, the last stitch of the back side and the first stitch of the front side. Because the needle is bendy, you can get them very close, and for many people they find that this helps resolve any issues with laddering. So I work across that side, and you see, and you can just drop that needle and it's perfectly fine, and you turn it around. Yeah. I recommend, if you're just beginning, return to the home position. Once you're experienced, you can do this in one maneuver. Return to the home position, make sure your working yarn is off the back, and then again, pull the needle out. Okay. What's happening is that your rear stitches are on the bendy part of the cord, which means that you do need a bendy needle for this. The older circular needles, the ones you may have inherited from your grandma, those are probably not going to work for this because the ends, the cords, are not bendy enough. You also need a pretty smooth join because you spend a lot of time moving the stitches around, as I'm about to show you, because I finished working my half. There we go. You can always tell a magic loop knitter because she just drops the needle when she's done the side. And so return to home position. See, sliding the stitches around, you need a nice smooth join, and then pull this out and keep going. Working with two circular needles is essentially the same process, but spoiler alert, you've got two circular needles, two shorter ones as well. I like to use 16-inch. Some people use a 24-inch. It's really your preference. Same process in that you've got half and half, and you want the working yarn to be hanging off the back, and I'm going to knit the front stitches. But what you do here is you work the stitches with the needle they're on. Needle loyalty, if you will. And so I knit across these stitches with the needle that they are on. And it can be helpful with this if the needles are different in some way. You might want to use one bamboo and one metal needle. Or what some people do is they apply nail polish to the tips of one of the two needles, or use Sharpie in some way. Just make them different so you don't mix up. So I've worked across the first needle one side, and I pull down onto the cord just so it's a bit easier to handle, and I turn around, and then I go back and I knit this. So you're treating each side of your sock or mitten or sleeve cuff or whatever it is as basically a piece of straight knitting on a circular needle, and the other circular needle just becomes this rather dangly, clicky stitch holder. But that's all. This again, easy, good for travel because you can't drop or lose a needle. It's a little bit pokier because you've got 4 points rather than 2. I personally, I find it a little bit faster than magic loop because there's a little less sliding around, but it is a bit pokier. The point about these methods, two circulars or magic loop, is that it's purely personal preference. Find a method that you like and use that one for these things. The process is the same. If you're making a sock, if you're making a mitten cuff, if you're making the top of a hat, if you're making a sleeve cuff, it's exactly the same process. These are just about how the stitches are arranged on your needles.